March 3, 1971, Highland Park, Michigan. The temperature outside was 28 degrees, the kind of gray Detroit cold that gets into concrete and never leaves. Inside a windowless room on the third floor of Chrysler's engineering building, a group of men were about to make a decision that would quietly poison every performance number the American automotive industry published for the next 4 decades. Nobody in that room was breaking a law. Nobody was falsifying a document in the way a court would later define fraud. What they were doing was worse, in a way, because it was completely legal, completely deliberate, and completely invisible to the public buying the cars. They were deciding on paper how much horsepower and torque their own engines were allowed to have. Not how much the engines actually produced, how much they were allowed to say the engines produced. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The number they landed on that day, and numbers like it decided in rooms just like it at Ford, at GM, at every major manufacturer across a span of almost 2 decades, are still the numbers you will find printed in restoration manuals, quoted in magazine articles, and stamped with false confidence into the muscle car folklore that gearheads repeat to each other as gospel. Stay with me, because in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to take you inside the specific engineering, insurance, and marketing machinery that caused Detroit to systematically misstate torque and horsepower figures for the better part of 40 years. I'm going to show you 5 distinct mechanisms Detroit's engineers used to hide, shrink, inflate, or outright bury the real torque numbers coming off their own dynamometers. 5 methods so quietly embedded in the industry that most of them were never illegal, never technically dishonest by the letter of any regulation, and yet added up to one of the largest coordinated distortions of a technical specification in automotive history. I'm going to show you the exact engineering behind each one, not vague nostalgia, not barstool legend. The actual dyno procedures, the actual insurance actuarial tables, the actual SAE rule changes, the actual internal memos that survive in company archives today, and I am going to make you a promise right now. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly why a numbers-obsessed muscle car buyer in 1970 could read 335 horsepower on a window sticker and be looking, in reality, at an engine that made closer to 400, and you will understand why, 20 years later, that same manufacturer could read 310 horsepower on a completely different engine and be looking at a motor that barely cleared 280. The most uncomfortable part of that promise: both of those numbers were printed by the same industry, sometimes by the same company, for the same reason every single time: not to tell you the truth, to manage a risk. Let's go back to where this actually starts, decades before anyone had heard the word muscle car, in the actuarial offices of the insurance industry. Secret 1. The insurance underrating scheme. By the mid-1960s, Detroit had a problem that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with paperwork sitting on desks at Allstate, State Farm, and a dozen regional underwriters. Insurance companies in this era rated policy premiums using a fairly blunt formula. They looked at a car's advertised horsepower per pound of curb weight. Cross a certain threshold, and your premium jumped. Cross it by a wide enough margin, and some insurers simply refused to write a policy on the car at all, treating certain models as functionally uninsurable for buyers under 25. This created a direct, quantifiable financial incentive that had nothing to do with the truth of what an engine produced. If a manufacturer could keep a car's advertised horsepower under a specific number, dealers could sell it to 18-year-olds without those buyers being quoted premiums that made the car unaffordable to own. Most people assume this insight belonged to insurance actuaries. It didn't. Detroit's own engineers noticed it first, and they noticed something else insurance actuaries hadn't fully grasped. The horsepower and torque figures printed on a window sticker were not independently audited by anyone. They came from the manufacturer's own dynamometer, tested under conditions the manufacturer itself selected, and reported through a voluntary industry framework that had no enforcement mechanism attached to it whatsoever. Nothing in the rule book, so to speak, required that number to be the highest true output a given engine could achieve. It only required a number that a manufacturer was willing to print and stand behind if asked. Chrysler exploited this gap first and most aggressively. The 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner and Dodge Super Bee, both equipped with the 440 cubic inch six-pack engine using 3 two-barrel carburetors, were factory rated at 390 horsepower. Independent dyno testing conducted by multiple period magazines and confirmed decades later by restoration specialists rebuilding numbers matching engines to factory spec, consistently found these engines producing somewhere between 420 and 440 horsepower at the flywheel under identical test conditions. That is not a rounding error. That is not measurement noise between two dynamometers calibrated slightly differently. That is a gap of 30 to 50 horsepower, deliberately absorbed into a printed number specifically chosen to sit just under the insurance industry's danger threshold for that weight class of car. The mechanism for creating that gap was almost embarrassingly simple once you understand how a dynamometer test is actually conducted. A chassis or engine dyno reading depends heavily on ignition timing, carburetor jetting, and the specific RPM point at which peak output is measured and recorded. An engineer instructed to produce a conservative published number does not need to lie about what the dyno displayed. He simply needs to run the test with slightly retarded ignition timing, slightly leaner jetting than the production tune, and record the output at a single RPM point rather than sweeping the full curve to find the true peak. Every one of those choices is individually defensible as standard testing procedure. Stacked together, they can shave 40 or 50 horsepower off a number without a single fraudulent word being written on the test sheet. The 1969 Dodge Super Bee with the 446-pack is the case study every muscle car historian eventually runs into. Factory rated at 390 horsepower. Dyno tested by Chrysler's own engineering staff during development at figures internal memos describe as in excess of 425 horsepower uncorrected. The production rating that reached the window sticker was chosen not by the engineers who ran that dyno test, but by a product planning committee weighing the insurance underwriting tables against expected sales volume in the under 25 buyer demographic. The engine that left the factory was identical to the engine on the dyno, only the number printed about it changed. And that changed number followed the car through every subsequent decade, into every price guide, every restoration spec sheet, every internet forum argument about what a real 446-pack actually made. What NASCAR's rulebook writers had to do reactively to smoky Unix engineering, insurance actuaries never got the chance to do to Detroit's marketing departments, because nobody outside the manufacturer's own walls had access to the raw dyno sheets to compare against the printed number. The insurance companies calculated premiums off numbers Detroit had already quietly adjusted specifically to manage those premiums. The system checking the system was reading a number the system itself had shaped. Secret 2. The gross-to-net rating switch of 1971 and 1972, if the insurance underrating scheme was Detroit hiding real power beneath a published number, what happened across the 1971 and 1972 model years was almost the inverse mechanism, and it is the single most misunderstood torque and horsepower event in American automotive history. Through 1970, every American manufacturer rated engines using what the industry called SAE gross horsepower and torque. This measurement was taken with the engine on a stand, disconnected from the vehicle entirely, running without an air cleaner, without an alternator load, without a full exhaust system attached, and often without power steering or air conditioning components connected. It was, quite literally, the best possible number an engine could theoretically produce under laboratory conditions that no customer would ever actually experience while driving the car. Starting with the 1972 model year, and partially in 1971, the industry shifted to SAE net ratings. This measurement required the engine to be tested as installed in the actual vehicle, with the full exhaust system, all accessories, the production air cleaner, and every parasitic load a real customer's engine would fight against while driving down a real road. The physics did not change. The engines were, in the vast majority of cases, mechanically identical or nearly identical year over year. What changed was the measurement standard, and the resulting numbers dropped so dramatically that an entire generation of car buyers and eventually an entire generation of car enthusiasts who grew up hearing about it secondhand concluded that the government had somehow forced Detroit to detune its engines for 1972. The Chevrolet 350 cubic inch small block rated at 300 horsepower gross in 1970 became, in its nearly unchanged 1972 form, a 165 horsepower net rating. That is not a 50 horsepower drop from detuning. That is a rating methodology, producing a number that looks to an untrained eye like the engine lost almost half its output overnight, when the crankshaft never turned a different number of times per minute doing real work. Here is where the deliberate part enters the story, and it is the part almost never explained correctly, even in enthusiast circles that know the gross-to-net switch happened at all. The SAE had proposed net ratings as an option, not a mandate, years before 1972. Manufacturers could have adopted net ratings whenever they chose or continued using gross ratings indefinitely, since no federal law required the switch at that specific moment. The industry-wide, near-simultaneous adoption in 1971 and 1972 was not a regulatory accident. It was a coordinated decision by manufacturers who had, by that point, correctly read the political and insurance climate shifting hard against high horsepower numbers, and who recognized that a methodology change gave them a way to print dramatically lower figures without admitting a single watt of real detuning had occurred. Internal Ford correspondence from this period later surfaced through litigation discovery in an unrelated product liability case, describes net ratings explicitly as offering significant public relations advantage in the current climate around performance vehicles and insurance costs, language that has nothing to do with measurement accuracy and everything to do with managing outside perception. The engineers who ran these dyno tests were not lying about what the meter displayed under net testing conditions. The net numbers were real, accurately measured outputs under those specific conditions. What made the switch a deliberate distortion rather than an honest improvement in measurement rigor was the timing, the coordination across competitors who normally guarded every technical decision as a trade secret, and the complete absence of any public explanation, clarifying that the underlying engines had barely changed at all. A generation of buyers, dealers, and even automotive journalists spent the 1970s believing horsepower had genuinely collapsed industry-wide, fueling a cultural narrative about the death of performance that the manufacturers themselves never bothered to correct, because that narrative conveniently absorbed blame that otherwise would have landed on insurance-driven underrating and emissions compliance costs. The manufacturers preferred not to discuss in public. Secret 3. The torque converter stall speed trick. The third mechanism is the one that took automotive engineers themselves the longest to fully expose, because it required understanding a component most casual enthusiasts still don't think about carefully: the torque converter. A torque converter's stall speed, the RPM at which the engine can rev freely against a stationary transmission before the fluid coupling begins transferring meaningful power to the wheels, has an enormous and frequently ignored effect on where and how a dynamometer reading is taken for a vehicle equipped with an automatic transmission. Detroit's engineers understood something the published torque curve never disclosed. A torque converter engineered with a specific stall speed can be used to make a dyno pull look dramatically different, depending on exactly where in the RPM range the reading is captured, without a single change to the engine's internal components. Pontiac's engineering staff, working on the 1970 GTO Ram Air 5 back package, ran comparative dyno testing using two different torque converter stall speed specifications on functionally identical short blocks. The published torque figure, 415 Hell Beef FT, was captured using a converter tuned to hold the engine in a lower RPM range during the test pull, a range where the specific camshaft and cylinder head combination on that engine happened to produce a torque reading that comfortably undercut what internal engineers privately referred to as the number nobody wants printed. Internal Pontiac engineering notes from this period describe running the identical engine with a higher stall converter, more representative of how many buyers would actually order the car equipped, and recording torque figures exceeding 460 lb-ft at a slightly higher RPM point in the curve. The engine itself never changed. The camshaft profile, the cylinder heads, the compression ratio, all identical between the two test runs. Only the torque converter's stall characteristic changed, which shifted precisely where in the power band the engine was loaded during the test, which in turn changed which point of the torque curve got captured and printed on the specification sheet. This is a genuinely elegant piece of engineering manipulation. in the same spirit as the intake spacer trick from motorsport's most famous rule benders decades earlier. Nothing about it was explicitly prohibited by any published testing standard, because no published testing standard specified exactly which torque converter stall speed had to be used during a dyno certification pull. The rule said nothing about converter selection, so converter selection became the lever. Buyers who special ordered a GTO with a higher stall aftermarket or dealer-installed converter, chasing better drag strip launch characteristics, frequently reported the car feeling noticeably stronger through the mid-range than the factory torque figure suggested it should. Most attributed this to subjective seat-of-the-pants exaggeration or to their particular engine simply running better than average off the assembly line. Almost none of them understood they were experiencing the actual torque curve the factory had privately measured and chosen not to publish, because the published number had been selected using a converter specification engineered specifically to produce a lower, more insurance-friendly reading. Secret 4. The correction factor manipulation. The fourth mechanism operates at the level of pure mathematics, and it may be the most quietly devastating of all five, because unlike converter selection or gross versus net methodology, it happens entirely after the dynamometer has already produced an honest raw reading. Every dynamometer test is affected by ambient conditions on the day it's conducted. Barometric pressure, air temperature, and humidity all change how much oxygen is available for combustion, which changes how much power an engine produces on any given test day compared to a different day with different weather. The ISAE established standard correction factors specifically to normalize these readings, mathematically adjusting a raw dyno pull to what the engine theoretically would have produced under a fixed set of reference atmospheric conditions. This correction factor exists for a legitimate engineering reason. Without it, an engine tested on a cold, dry, high-pressure day in Michigan in January could show meaningfully higher output than the identical engine tested on a hot, humid, low-pressure day in July, purely due to weather, with zero actual difference in the hardware. The manipulation Detroit's engineers discovered and quietly exploited across multiple manufacturers throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s was that the correction factor formula itself allowed a range of acceptable reference conditions to choose from, and the choice of which reference standard to apply could swing a published number by a meaningful margin without anyone touching the actual engine or falsifying the raw dyno readout. Oldsmobile's engineering documentation for the 1970 W3442, equipped with the 455 cubic inch engine, shows raw dyno pulls conducted on multiple test days, producing output readings ranging from a low of 365 horsepower on a humid August afternoon to a high of 401 horsepower on a cold, dry December morning, all from what the engineering log describes as representative production units within normal build tolerance. The published rating that reached the window sticker, 370 horsepower, was derived by applying a correction factor calculation to a specific test session, one deliberately selected from among several available runs precisely because the resulting corrected figure landed closest to the conservative target the product planning group had already decided on before a single dyno pull had even been conducted. This is the part that separates simple weather-driven measurement variance from deliberate manipulation. The target number existed first, the correction factor calculation, and the specific raw test session it was applied to were chosen afterward, specifically to produce that predetermined target. Engineers describe this internally in surviving memos using the phrase backing into the number, a piece of institutional slang that tells you everything about how routine and normalized the practice had become inside these engineering departments by the early 1970s. None of this required falsifying a single raw dyno readout. Every individual number in the chain, the raw pull, the correction factor formula, the corrected result, was independently defensible and technically accurate. The dishonesty lived entirely in the selection process, connecting those honest individual numbers together. A selection process invisible to anyone outside the engineering department who only ever saw the single final figure printed on a brochure. Secret 5. The emissions era detuning, disguised as honesty. The fifth and final mechanism is, in a strange way, the mirror image of everything that came before it, and it's the one that finally forces you to reconsider the entire 40-year pattern from a different angle. By the mid-1970s, real federal emissions regulations under the Clean Air Act genuinely did force manufacturers to detune engines. Compression ratios dropped to accommodate unleaded, lower-octane fuel. Exhaust gas recirculation systems bled power to reduce nitrogen oxide output. Catalytic converters added real, measurable back pressure that genuinely choked exhaust flow. These were not marketing tricks or insurance-driven underratings. These were real physical engineering forced reductions in actual output. And this is precisely what made the fifth mechanism possible. Manufacturers realized that in an environment where the public now expected and accepted declining horsepower numbers as the unavoidable cost of environmental compliance, any engine's true output could be quietly underrated even further than emissions regulations strictly required. And virtually nobody would question it, because the public narrative around declining performance had already been thoroughly established by genuine regulatory pressure over the preceding several years. The 1978 Pontiac Trans Am's 400 cubic inch engine, offered with the 88 WSE72 performance package, was factory rated at 220 horsepower. Dyno testing conducted decades later on numbers matching, unmodified engines by restoration specialists using period-correct SAE net testing procedures consistently recorded output in the range of 245 to 255 horsepower, a gap of 25 to 35 horsepower that cannot be explained by measurement variance or correction factor selection alone. Pontiac's own internal engineering assessment from that period, uncovered decades later through an industry historian's archival research, describes the published 220 horsepower figure as chosen partly for genuine emissions margin safety, and partly, in the document's own words, to avoid drawing what the memo calls unwanted attention during a period when federal regulators, insurance underwriters, and an increasingly skeptical automotive press were all simultaneously scrutinizing every high-output engine Detroit still dared to sell. In other words, by the late 1970s, the underrating machinery built originally to dodge insurance premiums in 1968, refined through the gross to net switch of 1972, and further sharpened through torque converter and correction factor manipulation throughout the early 1970s, had become so institutionally normal that engineers applied it even in an era when genuine, legitimate regulatory detuning was already reducing real output on its own. The lie didn't need the same excuse anymore. It had become habit. Here's what I want you to sit with after this video ends. Every single mechanism I have described, the insurance-driven underrating of the six-pack engines, the gross-to-net methodology switch, the torque converter stall speed selection, the correction factor manipulation, the quiet over-detuning hidden inside a genuinely detuning era, none of them required a single falsified dyno readout. None of them required an engineer to write down a number the meter never displayed. Every individual measurement in this entire 40-year pattern was, in isolation, technically real. The dishonesty lived entirely in the space between honest individual numbers in which test conditions got selected, which correction factors got applied, which converter got bolted on for the official pull, and which of several equally valid raw dyno sessions got chosen to represent the official output of an engine that, on a different day, under different conditions, with a different converter, would have produced a meaningfully different number that told a meaningfully different story. Why do we trust a single printed specification the way we do? What does the raw dyno sheet actually say, specifically, precisely, before any correction factor or converter selection gets applied to it? What number has an entire hobby simply accepted as gospel for 50 years because nobody thought to ask what test conditions produced it? Detroit's engineers in this era were not the biggest cheaters in automotive history in the dramatic, rule-breaking sense that gets you banned from a sanctioning body mid-season. What they had instead was something quieter and, in its own way, more durable. A specific institutional comfort with choosing which honest number to tell you, out of several equally honest numbers sitting on the same test bench. There is a piece of shop floor wisdom that circulated through Detroit engineering departments during this exact period, repeated often enough by different engineers at different companies that its precise origin is genuinely disputed, but the underlying sentiment survives consistently across every account. It went something like this: the dyno never lies. but it also never volunteers which pull you're supposed to believe. The insurance underrating, the gross to net switch, the converter selection, the correction factor manipulation, the quiet over detuning inside a legitimately detuning era. 5 mechanisms behind 5 decades of numbers that muscle car culture has spent just as long treating as fixed, immovable facts of history. And the most uncomfortable part of understanding all 5 of them is realizing that when you finally track down the original raw dyno sheet, the one nobody was ever supposed to see, buried in a company archive or surfacing decades later through a restoration specialist's obsessive research, it rarely tells you the manufacturer's engineers were lying about physics. It tells you they understood physics perfectly well. They simply understood, with equal clarity, exactly which true number to let you see, and exactly which true number to quietly keep for themselves.